At the funeral, black twins shout, "Mommy is alive," and a lawyer discovers the truth. In the midst of mourning, a moment of disbelief shatters the silence. Two young black twins rise and declare, "Mommy is alive." It's a cry from the depths of innocence, but is it just grief speaking, or is it the voice of a truth no one dares to face? This is a story of resilience, buried secrets, and the unshakable power of love. Through the eyes of a determined lawyer, we're taken on a journey to uncover a hidden reality that challenges everything we thought we knew. What if it were you? Would you seek the truth no matter the cost? Tell us where you're watching from. I want to hear your story, and don't forget to subscribe. This isn't just a tale, it's a reflection of how love and courage can reshape destiny. The funeral parlor was filled, but the atmosphere was somber and heavy, as if an invisible fog enveloped every corner, every face. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered to bid farewell to Victoria, a woman who had been a pillar of strength in life, an attorney who tirelessly fought for her clients, and a mother who had given everything for her daughters. The news of her death in a car accident had hit like a bucket of cold water, leaving everyone speechless, especially Janet, who had shared not only a deep friendship with Victoria but also her professional life. Janet stood by the closed casket, contemplating the dark wood that covered her friend's body. She had hoped, perhaps naively, to say goodbye to her friend in a more tangible way, to see her face one last time, but George, Victoria's husband, stood firm in his decision, assuring her that the accident had left Victoria's body unrecognizable. "It's not something anyone should see," George had said. She couldn't understand how someone so full of life and so cautious behind the wheel could end up this way so suddenly. Victoria always took the time to fasten her daughter's seatbelts, to check the car before starting, to ensure that nothing escaped her control, but now there was Janet, bearing the weight of a loss that felt as unjust as it was incomprehensible. To one side, the twin girls, Lucy and Leah, just 5 years old, sat together on a bench, their gaze lost on the ground, not fully grasping the magnitude of what was happening. Janet watched them with a heavy heart. She knew how much they meant to Victoria and how much Victoria meant to them. She promised herself that she would do whatever it took to protect them, just as Victoria would have wanted. But wait, could this innocence hold the key to an unimaginable secret? The silence in the room was interrupted when suddenly Lucy stood up and, in a soft but clear voice, said, "Mommy is still alive." Janet felt a chill run down her spine. The attendees turned to look at the little girl, some with compassionate glances, others with discomfort. Leah, her sister, looked at her with a nod of agreement, as if she shared that certainty. "Yes, Mommy is still alive," Leah repeated with the same naturalness. Janet observed the twins, feeling that there was something deeper behind those words. Most of the people in the room looked at the girls with sadness, attributing their statement to the pain and confusion that came with their young age, but deep in her heart, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. What did it really mean that Victoria was still alive? Was it the innocence of the girl speaking, or something that Janet couldn't fully comprehend? With a quick glance at the casket, as if searching for impossible answers, Janet approached the girls and knelt before them. "Why do you think your mommy is still alive?" she asked gently, trying not to make them uncomfortable but needing to understand. Lucy looked at her with her big white eyes, filled with an inexplicable conviction for a child her age. "She told me last night," she said. "She said everything would be okay." Lucy replied, her voice firm. Leah nodded, adding softly, "Yeah, she said not to cry, that we would see her again soon." Janet swallowed hard, feeling goosebumps rise on her skin. Everyone else continued to be absorbed in the heavy silence of the room, oblivious to the conversation that had just taken place. However, for Janet, every word from the girls resonated like an echo of something that eluded logic. The ceremony continued, and one by one, the attendees began to say their goodbyes, leaving the place in a cold calm that only heightened the emptiness Janet felt. As everyone left, Janet stayed behind, watching how the twins clung to the casket with an odd calmness, without tears, as if they were convinced their mother would return. That night, Janet lay awake, replaying in her mind every detail of her relationship with Victoria, every conversation, and every shared moment. She remembered how Victoria had always spoken about life with a blend of pragmatism and sensitivity, how she had planned every last detail to secure a good future for her daughters, but now, on that night when the weight of loss kept her awake, those words from Lucy and Leah kept swirling in her head, "Mommy is still alive." What did they really mean? The phrase echoed like a drumbeat, growing louder, more confounding. She decided that, no matter how much it hurt, she had to investigate. Something inside her told her that Victoria hadn't fully left, that this accident wasn't as clear as it seemed. She owed it to Victoria, and she owed it to those girls who had just lost the most important person in their lives. Janet began to recall some strange situations in the weeks leading up to the accident, calls at unusual hours, conversations abruptly interrupted when someone else approached, the strange silence Victoria had maintained on certain topics, and how, in her final days, she always seemed to look over her shoulder, as if someone were following her. She couldn't ignore those details now. The pieces started to come together in her mind like a puzzle she had overlooked until that moment. Janet made a firm decision: she would uncover the truth. The passing days hadn't diminished Janet's confusion, in fact, it had intensified. The way George had managed everything regarding Victoria's funeral raised questions without answers, small details that seemed innocent at first but took on a dark, unsettling tone when analyzed collectively. She remembered how, from the moment the accident was reported, George had taken control of every aspect, from the funeral arrangements to the choice of the closed casket. He had even avoided talking about the incident with a coldness that seemed to hide something deeper than mere grief. During the funeral, George's demeanor had been so rigid and composed that it bewildered anyone who looked at him. He stood there next to Victoria's casket, receiving condolences with an expression of apparent composure, as if his wife's death affected him not at all. There were no traces of tears on his face, nor any genuine display of pain. Janet watched him from a distance, trying to decipher that air of detachment that enveloped George like an invisible cloak. Victoria and George had always seemed like a solid couple, although in the weeks leading up to the accident, Janet had noticed some changes. Victoria, who used to be open and sincere with her, had begun to appear reserved and evasive. Conversations about her marriage, once fluid and filled with details, had now become short and superficial, as if Victoria were hiding something or afraid to speak too much. Janet remembered those moments now with a growing unease, feeling that she had overlooked important signals, details that, had she noticed them earlier, could have prevented this tragedy. One afternoon, while organizing some papers in her office, Janet made a firm decision: she couldn't just sit back and do nothing. She needed to know what had really happened. With a mix of determination and nervousness, she decided to go to the coroner's office to obtain Victoria's death certificate. Perhaps, she thought, that document would provide concrete answers about the causes of the accident, clarify how her friends last night had been, and who knows, maybe she would find some hint that helped her understand George's strange behavior. When she arrived at the coroner's office, the atmosphere was cold and formal, a brutal contrast to the warm air of the afternoon in the city. Janet approached the counter and requested to see the doctor in charge of Victoria's case. The receptionist, a woman with an expressionless face, looked at her over her glasses and nodded, indicating that she should wait. After a few minutes, the coroner appeared. He was a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor and eyes that seemed to avoid any kind of eye contact. He introduced himself briefly, skipping any additional formalities, and then led her to his small office at the end of the hallway. Janet sat across from him, determination etched on her face. "Good morning, I'm Janet Brown, a close friend of Victoria Wilson. I'd like to obtain a copy of her death certificate," she said in a firm voice, trying to control her tone so it wouldn't reveal the mix of emotions overwhelming her. The coroner observed her for a few seconds before slowly nodding, his eyes flickering as he assessed the seriousness of her request, or perhaps he was deciding how much he could or should tell her. "I'm going to check the records," he replied, turning to his computer. His fingers typed slowly on the keyboard while his eyes scanned the screen with a look of confusion that he tried to conceal. Minutes passed in an uncomfortable silence. Janet watched every gesture of the man, trying to interpret the expression that was beginning to form on his face. After a while, the coroner looked back at her, but this time with a mix of discomfort and surprise. "It seems that there's no record in our files regarding the death certificate of Mrs. Wilson," he murmured, his tone attempting to disguise the evident tension in his voice. Janet felt a slight tremor in her chest. The doctor's response seemed absurd, almost as if he were trying to evade reality in some way. "What do you mean there's no record?" she asked, trying to keep calm but unable to hide the incredulity in her tone. "Victoria's death was days ago, there should be a certificate in your files." The coroner diverted his gaze to his desk, avoiding eye contact with Janet. He began shuffling papers back and forth in a nervous gesture that irritated her. Finally, he spoke again, though in an almost inaudible voice. "It must be a system error, perhaps there was a problem with the digital file or something like that." "I apologize," he said, continuing to fuss with the papers in a frantic manner. Janet was not convinced. The man's discomfort, his unwillingness to provide a clear answer, and that strange disarray on his desk all contributed to intensifying her suspicions. Something was not right, and she could not simply stand by waiting for the doctor to resolve a system error. "Excuse me, but I need a more concrete answer," she insisted, raising her voice slightly. "Is there any way to verify manually or to contact someone else who can provide the document?" The man looked at her again, this time with an expression of barely contained annoyance. He awkwardly stood up from his chair, as if he wanted to end the conversation as quickly as possible, and pointed to the door. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Brown, but I have other commitments that I cannot postpone. I suggest you come back in a few days, perhaps by then the system will have been updated," he said in a tone that clearly indicated the conversation was over. With no other option, Janet slowly stood up, feeling the frustration build in her chest. Before leaving the office, she took one last look at the doctor, who had already returned to his desk, completely ignoring her. She exited the building with a mix of anger and helplessness, and a more resolute conviction that there was something dark behind Victoria's death. During the drive back, thoughts crowded her mind, growing clearer and heavier with suspicion. She recalled Victoria's last weeks of life, how her friend seemed quieter, as if carrying an invisible burden she didn't want to share. Perhaps, Janet thought, George had something to do with that change. Could it be possible that he was involved in something darker than it seemed? That night, while she was in her apartment, she replayed every detail she had noticed since Victoria's death: George's insistence on keeping the coffin closed, the absolute control he had taken over the funeral details, and now the strange disappearance of the death certificate. It wasn't normal, everything pointed to a series of events concealed under a layer of carefully constructed formality. Janet decided that if she couldn't find answers at the coroner's office, she would seek them elsewhere. She would call Victoria's colleagues, ask if anyone knew anything about the days leading up to the accident, and even investigate George's background. She knew she was entering delicate territory, but she couldn't help it. Victoria had been like a sister to her, and she wouldn't rest until she knew the truth. Janet couldn't shake off the coroner's demeanor, the evasions, and the strange system error that supposedly caused the absence of Victoria's death certificate. Each time she thought of it, she felt her suspicions grow, enveloping her in an anxiety that became impossible to ignore. George's figure, serene and distant during the funeral, loomed in her mind again and again, reminding her that something in all this didn't add up. With this determination in mind, she decided that the best way to find answers was to speak directly with the people closest to Victoria, her daughters, Lucy and Leah. Though small, they might have valuable information, perhaps something they had seen or heard without understanding its true meaning. Janet knew she had to be careful, as talking to girls their age about their mother's death was delicate, still she felt compelled to try. She arrived at George's house on a cold, cloudy afternoon. The facade of the house looked as imposing as ever, with its tall walls and closed windows, as if hiding secrets behind its walls. Janet took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell, trying to prepare for what could be a confrontation. After a few seconds, the door opened, and George appeared in the doorway, wearing his usual expression of neutrality, almost cold. "Janet, what brings you here?" he asked, his voice lacking warmth. "I wanted to see Lucy and Leah, if it's not a bad time. I feel like I need to be near them so they can feel the support of someone who truly loved them," Janet replied, trying to keep her voice calm and her expression serene. George studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he nodded and stepped aside to let her in. "They're in the living room, you can see them for a few minutes, but I ask you not to talk too much about, their mother," George said, almost in a whisper, as if the mere mention of Victoria was something to avoid. Janet felt a pang of discomfort but said nothing. She walked down the hallway toward the living room, where the twins waited on the couch, their gazes distant, as if they were in another world. As soon as they saw her, their eyes sparkled with a hint of familiarity, and Lucy was the first to run to her, wrapping her small arms around her. "Aunt Janet," the little girl murmured, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "Hello, little ones," Janet said, kneeling to embrace both of them. "I've missed you so much." The girls seemed to want to say something, but at the same time, their discomfort was palpable. There was something in their gazes that reflected more than sadness, it was a mix of confusion and perhaps a little fear. Janet decided to get straight to the point, but in a way that didn't seem invasive. "Lucy, Leah, I wanted to talk a little about Mommy," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Do you remember what you said at the funeral? You said Mommy was alive. Can you tell me why you said that?" Leah looked at Lucy, as if seeking approval from her sister. Finally, it was Lucy who spoke first, her voice trembling. "We saw her. We saw Mommy at the bookstore," she whispered, as if afraid someone else might hear her. Janet felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to maintain her composure, though Lucy's words left her stunned. "You saw her at the bookstore," she repeated, keeping her voice soft so as not to scare them. "Are you sure?" Lucy nodded her head quickly. "Yes, it was Mommy. She was in the section where she always liked to look for books. She smiled at us, but then she disappeared," Leah said, her voice shaking a little. Janet's expression shifted from surprise to confusion. Was it possible that the girls were mistaken? Could it be that they had seen someone who looked like Victoria and, in their grief, confused them for her? But the twins' tone, the certainty in their words, left her perplexed. Before she could ask another question, George appeared in the doorway, his expression tense. "That's enough, Janet. The girls are tired," he said in a tone that allowed for no discussion. Janet nodded, feeling frustration build in her chest. The twins looked at their father with a mix of fear and resignation as they slowly retreated from the room, giving Janet one last glance before disappearing behind the door. George escorted her to the exit without saying a word. Janet said goodbye with a knot in her throat, feeling that George was hiding something important. She watched as he quickly closed the door, as if wanting to put a wall between her and the truth. Days passed, and the image of the girls continued to haunt her. She couldn't shake the thoughts of their words, the conviction with which they claimed to have seen their mother in the bookstore. Janet decided she couldn't leave it at that. She had to talk to the girls one more time, but without George present. She needed to find a way to see them alone and get clearer answers. One afternoon, taking advantage of George being at work, Janet returned to the house, hoping to speak with the twins again. She found them playing silently in the garden. Upon seeing her, their faces lit up, and they ran to her, hugging her tightly. This time, the atmosphere felt more relaxed, and Janet sensed that the girls were ready to open up a little more. "I wanted to ask you something important," she said, kneeling to be at their level. "Do you remember when you told me you saw Mommy at the bookstore? Can you tell me how it happened?" Lucy and Leah exchanged glances, and eventually, Leah began to speak. "It was last weekend. Daddy took us to the bookstore, the one we always visited with Mommy. We were in the story section when we saw her. She was standing at the end of the aisle, next to the big bookshelves," she said, her voice trembling. She smiled at us. "Are you sure it was your Mommy?" Janet asked, trying to hide the intensity of her curiosity. "Yes, she was wearing the same red dress she wore the last day we saw her," Lucy said without hesitation. Janet felt a chill run down her spine. The girls were describing specific details, the dress, the exact location. It was almost impossible for two such young girls to invent something so precise. Still, she needed to be sure they weren't mistaken. "Did you tell your dad about this?" she asked, trying not to sound too interested. The girls nodded slowly, fear visible on their faces. "Yes, but he got angry and told us not to say those things," Leah admitted in a quiet voice. Janet felt indignant upon hearing that. Why would George forbid them from talking about something like that? His reaction was alarming and only fueled the doubts in her mind. Perhaps George knew more than he let on and was trying to hide something at all costs. Janet gently stroked the girl's hair, trying to convey calm and security. "Don't worry, your words are important to me. I won't ignore what you've told me," she said, smiling softly. Before leaving, she made them promise to call her if they saw anything strange again. Lucy and Leah nodded, and Janet said goodbye to them with a weight in her chest that only intensified her determination to get to the bottom of the matter. Janet's resolve grew stronger each day. Lucy and Leah's words about having seen their mother in the bookstore, combined with George's evasive attitude and the irregularities in the death certificate, had pushed Janet to the brink of desperation. She needed proof, something tangible to confirm whether what she believed was possible was indeed true. Could Victoria still be alive, or was someone playing with everyone's minds? The mere thought that her friend might be hiding somewhere or being manipulated fueled Janet's determination to continue her investigation, no matter the risks. Without wasting any time, she decided to head to the bookstore mentioned by the twins. It had been Victoria and her daughter's favorite spot, a small refuge amidst the city's hustle and bustle, where they used to spend entire afternoons among books. Upon arriving, the familiar smell of paper and old wood enveloped her, bringing back memories of the time she had accompanied Victoria and the girls to search for stories and tales. As she wandered through the aisles, she glanced at the few customers, looking for any hint, any familiar face. The bookstore was quiet, with only a couple of people meandering between the shelves, and Janet felt a bit ridiculous for being there, watching like a detective in a crime novel. However, just as she was heading to the children's section, a figure at the end of the aisle caught her attention. The woman was facing away, looking at a book. Her posture, her hair, even the way she tilted her head, everything felt painfully familiar. Janet felt her heart race, barely managing to contain the impulse to run toward her. Still, she decided to approach cautiously, fearing that an impulsive reaction might startle the woman. "Victoria," she murmured softly, as if speaking the name could materialize her friend before her. The woman turned her head slightly at the sound of the name. Janet caught a glimpse of her profile, and in that instant, a wave of mixed emotions washed over her. It was her, it was Victoria, or at least someone identical to her. The woman looked at her for a second, and in her eyes, Janet recognized something immediately: fear. Without saying a word, the woman closed the book she was holding and began to walk quickly toward the exit. Janet stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what she had just seen. But when the woman disappeared through the door, a surge of impulse forced her to run after her. Questions piled up in her mind as she pushed open the bookstore door and looked around, searching for that figure among the crowd. "Victoria, wait," she shouted, trying to get her attention. The woman didn't stop but quickened her pace, weaving through the people walking on the sidewalk until she reached the parking lot. Janet followed closely, struggling to catch up, but as soon as she reached the area of cars, the woman had already entered a vehicle and was closing the door. Janet barely managed to glimpse the license plate before the engine roared to life and the car disappeared into traffic. Breathing heavily, Janet stood in the parking lot, watching the car drive away. A sense of loss washed over her. She had been so close to getting answers, and now the woman had vanished like a ghost. However, she had managed to catch an important detail: the license plate of the car. With this information, she could at least find out who this woman was and why she looked so much like Victoria. Back in her office, Janet used all the legal tools at her disposal to trace the vehicle's registration. After a series of searches, she found a name that left her even more confused: Madison Davis. The information indicated that she was a woman with no relevant background and no apparent ties to Victoria or her family. However, when she looked at a photograph in the records, Janet felt her suspicions being confirmed. Madison Davis was none other than Victoria, or at least a version of Victoria. "What the hell is going on here?" she murmured to herself, feeling confusion and bewilderment mixing in her mind. The idea that Victoria might have faked her death or that someone was forcing her to live under another identity seemed as absurd as it was intriguing. And if it really was her, why had she distanced herself from her daughters, from her life? Janet knew she couldn't move forward with just these suspicions. She needed something solid to prove that Victoria and Madison were the same person. That's when she made a drastic decision: she would request a court order to exhume Victoria's body. She knew this action would be seen as disrespectful by many, especially George, but something inside her told her it was the only way to obtain the truth. However, getting a judge to approve the exhumation wouldn't be easy. Her request needed to be backed by solid evidence, not just the words of the twins or her own perceptions. In the following days, Janet dedicated herself to gathering all the evidence she could present before the judge. She returned to the bookstore with a camera, hoping to find that woman who resembled Victoria once more. She spent hours lurking through the aisles, searching among the shelves, but the woman never reappeared. Nevertheless, Janet decided to document the place, and with the help of a small surveillance team, she managed to capture a blurry image, but clear enough to notice the woman's resemblance to Victoria. With that image in hand, she headed to court. Before the judge, she presented the photograph alongside her testimony and the accounts of the twins. She emphasized George's strange behavior, the absence of a death certificate, and the irregularities she had found in the process. She spoke of the last conversation with the twins, who claimed to have seen their mother, and of the mysterious car that belonged to a woman identical to Victoria but under another name. The judge listened attentively, although his expression reflected skepticism. He knew her request was unusual, but Janet was determined not to back down. She used all the arguments at her disposal, appealing to logic and the responsibility to investigate the truth. She spoke with a conviction that transcended her own doubts, trying to make the judge understand the urgency of her request. Days passed in agonizing wait, every minute seemed stretched, as if time were mocking her, prolonging her uncertainty. Finally, one morning, she received the news she had been eagerly awaiting: the court order had been granted. Janet arrived at the cemetery early in the morning, when the fog still cloaked the gravestones and the air was infused with the damp smell of the earth. Despite the tension, she steeled herself, convinced that exhuming Victoria was the only way to find answers. For days, she had endured the anxious wait for judicial approval, feeling that every passing minute was one less opportunity to uncover the truth. However, as she crossed the iron gate of the cemetery, she noticed a familiar figure in the distance. George was there, waiting for her by Victoria's grave. His rigid posture and arms crossed over his chest spoke of a simmering anger, a contained fury that Janet didn't remember seeing before. As she approached, their eyes met, and in his gaze, she found more than just anger. There was a mixture of pain and resentment that left her momentarily taken aback. "What do you think you're doing, Janet?" George shot out without preamble, his tone sharp and accusatory. Janet tried to maintain her composure, taking a deep breath before responding. "I'm looking for answers, George. Something about Victoria's death doesn't make sense, and the evidence I've gathered indicates there's more to this than what we've been told," she said, trying to sound firm, although her voice betrayed her discomfort at the confrontation. "Answers?" George replied, raising his voice. "Do you realize what you're doing? You're going to disturb Victoria's rest. You have no right to profane her memory like this." Janet felt a pang of guilt, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. Since Victoria's death, she had seen signs and evidence that couldn't be ignored, and while she understood George's pain, she also knew she couldn't back down. "George, I understand how you feel, but this is necessary. There are things that don't add up, and even the twins believe they saw their mother at the bookstore. They feel like Victoria is still alive. Shouldn't we at least consider that possibility?" "The twins?" George exclaimed in frustration, shaking his head. "They're just kids, Janet, kids who have lost their mother and are trying to make sense of it all. How can you use their words to justify this madness?" Janet stared at him, refusing to yield ground. Her mind wrestled between empathy for George's pain and her own need to clarify the truth. She pulled out the photographs she had obtained from the bookstore and handed them to George. "Look at these photos. This woman looks like Victoria. I saw her in the bookstore where your daughters claim to have seen her too. It's not just the imagination of some kids. I saw her myself, and when I tried to reach her, she escaped. Her name in the records is Madison Davis, but don't you see the resemblance?" George looked at the photos initially with disdain, but as he scrutinized them, his expression began to change. At first, he held them with indifference, as if they were mere images of someone insignificant, but then his eyes locked onto the woman's face in the photo. Janet noticed how his jaw tightened and how his gaze shifted from disbelief to confusion. For a moment, it seemed he was going to say something, but then he looked away, taking a deep breath. "This is a coincidence. It has to be. Victoria is dead, Janet." "This isn't possible," he murmured, although his voice now lacked the initial certainty. "George, there are too many coincidences in all of this. I don't want to believe that Victoria is alive and hiding under another identity for no reason, but we have to make sure. This is for the twins, for their right to know the truth," Janet insisted, giving urgency to her words. George fell silent for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on Victoria's grave, as if he were internally debating between two worlds, that of logic and that of doubt. Finally, he looked up, and in a broken voice, whispered, "I don't want to see Victoria exhumed. I don't want her to be disturbed like that, but if this is true," he paused, as if the words were too painful to utter. "If you really believe that Victoria is still alive, show me without disturbing her body." Janet sensed a shift in his words. The hardness had given way to a vulnerability she had never seen in George. His last sentence surprised her, and although she had come determined to carry out the exhumation, his request made her reconsider. "What do you suggest then?" she asked, seeking to understand the alternative he proposed. "Take me to that bookstore," George replied, looking at the photos once more. "Show me the place where the twins say they saw their mother. If there's something to see, I want to see it with my own eyes." Janet looked at him, somewhat taken aback. The idea that George would agree to accompany her was unexpected, but perhaps it was the only way to avoid the exhumation while still getting answers. She knew the decision was risky. If Victoria or someone resembling her appeared, things could complicate further, but she was willing to take the chance. She nodded slowly, giving George the assurance that she accepted his plan. "All right, we'll go to the bookstore. The twins said they saw her in the children's section. Maybe if we're lucky, that woman will show up again," Janet said with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. George seemed to hesitate for a moment but then nodded. He tucked the photos into his pocket and turned to leave the cemetery, his steps firm yet burdened with a contained emotion that made him appear vulnerable, almost defeated. Janet followed him, feeling an atmosphere laden with tension, mixed with the strange relief of not having to face the exhumation. The bookstore was bustling with people when they arrived, but the noise and laughter couldn't calm the nervousness in the air. Janet guided George to the section where Lucy and Leah had mentioned seeing their mother, and they both positioned themselves in a strategic corner where they could observe the customers without drawing too much attention. Minutes passed, and they remained silent, watching every movement, every face that approached the section. Time stretched, and George's patience began to wear thin. "This is madness," he murmured with a mix of exasperation and doubt. "Victoria is dead, Janet. Why are we here?" Janet was about to respond when suddenly a familiar figure appeared in the aisle. It was the same woman she had seen days before, identical to Victoria. She wore a gray coat, her hair down, and glasses that barely concealed her features. George watched her, and Janet noticed how his expression immediately changed, the skepticism he had shown before dissolving as he saw the evidence before his own eyes. "It can't be," George whispered in a tone barely audible. As she approached, the woman lifted her gaze, and her eyes widened in surprise at the sight of George next to Janet. Madison immediately closed the book she was holding and took a step back, as if her instinct told her to distance herself. "Madison," Janet tried to keep her tone calm and friendly, attempting to convey reassurance. "We just want to talk to you. We're not here to cause any trouble." Madison diverted her gaze to George, who was fixated on her, his face hardened as if he were trying to decipher the features of the woman before him, searching for traces of Victoria. Madison's discomfort was evident, and the book in her hands trembled slightly. "I don't know who you are or what you're talking about," Madison said, her voice shaky and evasive. "I think you're mistaken." "Are you sure?" Janet pressed, showing a small supportive smile, trying to earn her trust. "Victoria Wilson, lawyer, mother of 2 girls, the twins have seen you here before and said you look just like their mother." Madison's face tightened, her eyes blinking rapidly. For a brief moment, she glanced at George, then lowered her gaze to the floor. Janet felt a mix of frustration and pity. Madison's reaction made it clear that she was aware of something, but there was something about George that frightened her. "I'm sorry, I don't know anyone named Victoria," she replied, her voice quieter than before. George narrowed his eyes, taking a step forward, his presence intimidating and firm. Janet felt the tension rising in the situation, but before George could say anything, she placed her hand on his arm to stop him. "It's okay, Madison. If you ever want to talk or if you remember anything, here's my number," Janet said, handing her a card. Madison took it with a trembling hand, saying nothing more, and quickly walked away, disappearing among the shelves. Janet and George stood in the aisle, watching her retreat without looking back. The feeling of emptiness and confusion filled the silence between them, and without saying more, they both left the bookstore. That night, Janet sat in her apartment, gazing out the window, her mind tangled in thoughts and possibilities. Something in Madison's demeanor had made it clear to her that they weren't mistaken. This woman knew something, even if she refused to speak. Just as she was starting to lose hope of obtaining any answers, her phone vibrated unexpectedly. Seeing the unknown number sent a chill down her spine, and she answered without a second thought. Janet, the voice on the other end was shaky and barely a whisper.
Yes, is this Madison? Janet responded, holding her breath.
Yes, I wasn't honest today in the bookstore, Madison admitted, her tone filled with regret.
I didn't know you would be with him. I couldn't talk in front of George. I didn't want him to know that I know Victoria.
Janet straightened in her seat, attentive to every word. The suspicions she had harbored for so long were beginning to materialize into a confession, and she needed to hear every detail.
Madison, I'm here to help you, and if you really know Victoria, I need to know everything you can tell me, Janet said, trying to sound calm, even though her heart raced with emotion.
Madison paused, as if taking a breath to gather the courage to speak. I met Victoria a little over a year ago, she began, her voice heavy with melancholy. It was a chance encounter, we ran into each other at the same bookstore. We were both in the classic literature section. At first, it was just friendly chatter, but something about her felt strangely familiar. I noticed how our gestures, our mannerisms, they were so similar.
Janet listened intently, not interrupting.
Every word from Madison added a new piece to the puzzle. A few weeks later, I saw her again, and we decided to grab a coffee. During our conversation, an unexpected topic came up: adoption. In the end, we discovered that we had both been adopted, and we decided to investigate further, Madison continued, her voice growing more assertive.
We did a DNA test.
The result was clear: we were twin sisters.
Janet was momentarily speechless.
The revelation left her stunned, and everything began to fit together in a way she had never imagined. Victoria had a twin sister, a woman who led a completely separate and unknown life to everyone.
However, this revelation only raised more questions. Why didn't you talk about this? Why keep it a secret? Janet asked, trying to understand.
Madison paused, as if recalling something painful. Victoria didn't want anyone to know about our relationship, especially not George, she admitted, her voice taking on a serious tone. She told me she was going through a tough time in her marriage. She didn't trust George. I tried to convince her to leave the relationship, but she resisted. She said she couldn't leave the house because of the girls, and that something very serious was happening in her professional life. Janet felt how each sentence from Madison increased her discomfort. Her friend had kept secrets that ran too deep, secrets that had isolated her in her own suffering.
What do you mean? What was happening? Janet asked, anxious to know more.
Shortly before her accident, Madison paused, as if the memory pained her. Victoria discovered something terrible about George. In one of the cases she was working on, while investigating financial documents, she found evidence that he was involved in embezzlement. She said she had been reviewing accounts from the company where they were both partners and discovered suspicious transfers. Plus, Madison took a breath, her voice trembling, she found out he had a second family. Janet felt the air grow thick, as if the weight of those words was crushing her. Victoria had been living a double nightmare: a broken marriage, a treacherous husband, and, on top of it all, the threat that the man she shared her life with could be involved in a serious crime. Victoria planned to confront him, Madison continued, but she was scared of what he might do if the truth came to light. She feared for her daughters, for her career, and for what George could do to her. She told me she was going to confront him, but first, she wanted to gather more evidence. Janet felt a mix of anger and pain for her friend. Victoria, always so strong and determined, had been trapped in a web of lies and betrayals, with no one to support her. She had faced that battle alone, silently protecting her daughters and fighting her own fears.
Do you think her death wasn't an accident? Janet asked in a whisper, barely believing what she was saying.
Madison fell silent for a few moments, as if those words caused her profound pain.
I don't know, she finally replied, her voice trembling. All I know is that Victoria was scared of George, and shortly before her death, she told me she was preparing to confront him. The conversation lasted a few more minutes as Madison shared every detail she could remember about Victoria's last days. When she finally hung up, Janet remained silent, processing everything she had just heard. The new information revealed by Madison left Janet in a state of constant alert. The reality that Victoria's death could have been more than an accident haunted her, and she felt she had to seek justice for her friend. Victoria had been a strong, brave woman, and the least she deserved was for her truth to come to light, especially if someone close had played a role in her demise. Determined to get answers, Janet returned to her office and began reviewing the documents that Victoria had left behind. She had managed to keep copies of some important files that Victoria had entrusted to her in the past, and she decided to examine each one meticulously. She knew she had to be very careful, as any misstep could alert George. She started by opening the last case Victoria had worked on, a financial investigation involving suspicious money transfers within the company they both shared. Day after day, Janet dedicated hours to tracing every transaction, every record, and every detail that could reveal the scheme George had constructed. With each document she analyzed, the magnitude of the fraud became clearer. George wasn't just diverting company funds, he was transferring them to hidden accounts under false names and in banks that were difficult to trace. Janet realized that what Victoria had uncovered was a dangerous secret, one that could destroy George's reputation and freedom. As she delved deeper into the financial records, Janet discovered something even more disturbing: a series of transfers made to a woman who had never appeared in the company's documents. After several hours of additional investigation, she learned that this woman was, in fact, the mother of George's children from his second family. George had not only concealed a parallel relationship but had also used company resources to sustain his double life. Janet felt a mix of rage and frustration as she came to understand the extent of George's betrayal. Victoria hadn't just been deceived as a wife, she had been a victim of a man willing to ruin everything to protect his interests. However, Janet was determined to continue. She promised herself that she would gather the necessary evidence to build a solid case against him, for Victoria, for the twins, and for all the people affected by this man's actions. For weeks, she worked in silence, avoiding any contact with George to avoid raising suspicions. Each day was a race against time in which Janet dedicated every free hour to examining records, verifying transactions, and discreetly interviewing people who had worked closely with Victoria. Little by little, she began to assemble a case, a collection of irrefutable evidence that exposed the financial fraud in George's secret life. With each document she added to the file, she felt Victoria's presence beside her, encouraging her to keep going. Finally, when she had all the evidence she needed, she decided it was time to confront him. She knew that George would try to deny everything, but she was ready for any reaction. With a complete file and copies of every piece of evidence stored in different places, she headed to George's house,